2 weeks ago, I was talking with Dirk. We were making some of the preparations for PTC, and Dirk told me that he had invited some people that he knew in Europe to join us at PTC, and they said they didn't want to come. So I said, well, why? And they said, well, we already know everything about Finale, so we don't need to come. And Dirk said, but it's a good deal. You get lots of training, and we're going to have networking and demo and great technology exhibits. And they said, no, we know everything about Finale. So I took this as a challenge. I'm going to make them pay. For the last 2 weeks, I have dedicated to myself to making sure that you guys would see all kinds of things that those people who turned down the invitation, the personal invitation from Dirk, are going to miss. So I started 2 weeks ago, and you'll see in your bag, there's a little time code reference card. I thought this would be kind of useful to put down all of the hotkeys. And there are at least 2 or 3 new features that are just released today. So I'm 100% sure that those people who turned down going to PTC don't know about them because they didn't exist until today. One of them is the nudge feature. So you can now use the arrow keys to nudge effects, to move them a little bit to the left or to the right on the timeline, and you can choose whether they move ahead and behind back 1 frame or a certain fraction of a second. You can choose what the increment of the nudge is. And then on the back of this time code card is also a little programmer hack if you want to change the color of the song waveforms on the timeline. There's a little secret in the purple square down here showing how you can change the color to anything you want. So that was the first thing that I did 2 weeks ago. That was just out of spite. But the good thing about this conversation 2 weeks ago was that it showed me how I should do this talk. This talk is on building the perfect rack layout. And this is a difficult talk because racking and addressing is very complex, and it's not very exciting. I don't get to show lots of beautiful graphics, but it's really important for your shows. And there are very deep features in Finale that are capable of doing very special things that may be important to you, that may be different from what's important to someone else. So I had thought a lot about how to do this talk, and when Dirk told me of the people who said they already knew everything, that gave me the idea for how to do this talk. We would start out, I'm going to show you the most sophisticated, advanced, magical thing that Finale can do for racks. So whether you're an expert already with addressing and racking in Finale, or whether you're just a beginner, what I hope you will appreciate in this first section is seeing something where the software is really doing something that's very difficult for a human to do without the assistance of software. What's especially great about this first section is that it also uses some of the technologies from one of the technology vendors in the trade show. So we'll start with that. That's going to take about a half an hour. And then I'm going to walk through some basic but important racking features in Finale, where some of the people who are here who are already experts, you're probably going to know most of these, but there may be 1 or 2 that you don't know. Or maybe the way that I explain it will be helpful. Throughout the first section and the second section, I have recorded 10 tips, 10 special little knowledge notes that are important to remember. And I think probably some of you know many of the 10, but there are probably some in the 10 that everyone here doesn't know. So that's what the handout contains. So when you're watching section 1 and section 2 of this talk, you'll see where the tips come in during the talk. Okay, let's jump in. The sophisticated, advanced thing that we're going to start with is for a large show that uses racks like this. How do you allocate the correct number of racks? And how do you allocate the tubes within the racks? Here's what makes this a little bit special and a lot complicated. First of all, the rows of tubes are fannable on a single axis. That's not especially uncommon. There are a lot of racks that have fannable tubes or fannable holders. The next thing that makes this rack challenging is that the holders on the outsides of the rack can tilt to more extreme angles than the holders in the center. And that makes sense, of course, because the outside ones can tilt to 90 degrees, but the holders in the interior of the rows, they'll bonk into their neighbors, so they can't turn to 90 degrees or they would be pointing right at their neighbors. So the interior tubes can only tilt to about 60 degrees. The third thing that's complicated about this rack is that the tubes are already connected to the firing system, or to the firing system module. That means that the wire for pin number 1 of the module is already connected to a specific tube. If the tube that pin number 1 is connected to happens to be at the end of a row, then that means pin number 1 can be used for an effect whose angle can go all the way to 90 degrees. But if tube number 1 happened to be connected to, if pin number 1 happened to be connected to a tube in the interior of a row, then it couldn't tilt 90 degrees because that tube is in the interior of the row. It would bump into another tube. So when calculating the addresses, the pin numbers and the module numbers for the effects, we have to take into account the angle ranges of all of the tubes when we're selecting which tube and which rack and how many racks are needed for the show. So what I'm going to show you is the software will be able to calculate the optimal number of racks, and it will be able to lay out, to choose the tubes and the tube angles optimally so that it's easiest to set up. But in order to do that, we first have to describe the rack or define the rack accurately so that the software knows what it's dealing with. We have to define, as you can see in this rack, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It has 30 holders. And in finale, and this is actually tip number 1 on the list. In finale, you can kind of wonder whether, is a row horizontal in this diagram or is a row vertical? And we had to choose a convention. So we chose the convention that a row is in the direction that the tubes can fan. So if you think of your hand as a fan, your hand is a row, and the fingers are the tubes of a row. That means that if you look at this diagram again, the knobs on the outside are connected to axes, or pins that go through, and that's the axis of rotations for the tubes. So if my hand was a fan, because the knobs are on the right side here, the rows are like my hand fanning out like that. So switching back to this diagram, the knobs are on this side. So that means that the rows are the vertical rows here. They're not the horizontal rows. If we defined it wrong for finale, if we gave finale the wrong definition of the rack, then it wouldn't give you the right angles for the tubes. So the way that we count in finale is that the first row is on the left. And so this rack has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows of 5 tubes per row. And I mentioned at the beginning that this rack is very special in that the holders are pre-wired so that it's fast to set up. And you can see in the picture here, the pin numbers for the pre-wiring are specified in this definition. In the upper right corner is pin number 1, and it goes down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the pre-wired pin numbers are by row, right to left when you look at it in a diagram like this. I'm focusing on this because right now we have to define the rack in order to get the benefit of the software telling us how many of these racks we need and laying out the tubes within the rack. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in now and define this rack to match, define this rack in finale to match the diagram we were just looking at. To do that, to define a rack in finale, you go to the Racks menu, create rack. You define what type of rack it is. You choose what type of rack it is. This is a single shot rack, adjustable fan angles within each row. That was the first characteristic of this rack. The next characteristic was that it had pre-wired pins. And if you remember the diagram, it was sequential by rows starting in the upper right. So it was sequential by rows right to left. That was the order of the pre-wired pins. The number of rows was 6, and the number of tubes was 5. In each row. And the angles for this rack, for each row, I'm going to specify the range for each tube in the row. The quickest way to do this is, for each tube, I'm going to start with minus 60 degrees. In that diagram, that would sort of be up in the previous diagram we were looking at, to 60 degrees, which would be down. And then I'll change the ends. So minus 60 to 60. Two, three, four, 5. change this one to 90. This one to minus 90. So what I typed in there was, there were 5 tubes, and using copy-paste, each tube I started out by saying it could go from minus 60 to 60 degrees. This was choosing the convention that 0 is up. And then for the tubes on the end, I adjusted them so that instead of minus 90 on the left end, it was able to go instead of minus 60, it went to minus 90, and on the right end, instead of plus 60, it went to plus 90. Okay, we've just defined this rack. We'll call this I shot 30. So we defined that rack, and I added that to my effects list, or items list. The rack's definitions go into the same list as the effect definitions. It's kind of weird, but that's the way it works. So now I've moved to the rack layout view, and I have a show here that just has a bunch of angled effects that I know fits in some number of these racks. And so I prepared this show as an example. The first thing I'll do is I'll add the racks. Oops. I'll add the racks that we just created. Great, here they are. I'll do that again so you can see. So we're starting with 0 racks, and we're asking Finale, we started with a show of a certain number of effects, and what we want to know is how many of these racks do we need for the show. So I click this button down here that says Add Racks, and it presents a dialog that says the racks that I can choose from are from this list, and I'm choosing the rack that we just defined. And if I choose that rack that we just defined, it reminds me that this rack can hold 30 tubes, and I have a total of 120 effects in the show. So it says that I need 120 divided by 30 equals 4 racks. And so when I click Add, it added 4 racks. Now, notice how the racks are coming in sideways. They're turned sideways. Why is that? Well, the definition of the rack had the rows vertical, but we want the fans to be horizontal in the show, because the fans in the show are left and right, they're not forward back. So the rack had to be brought in rotated sideways with the rows horizontal now. Okay, so now I'll click the address button to assign firing system addresses and to allocate tubes within the racks for these effects. So the addressing dialog in Finale gives you a choice as a pyrotechnician to choose the order in which you assign the effects in the show. This is leading to the second tip in the handout, tip number 2. Tip number 2, I don't think this has ever been written down publicly before. So you may be the only people who've seen the actual layout of the addressing algorithm outside of the programmers at Finale. But this is basically, tip number 2, outlines the algorithm that Finale uses when you assign firing system addresses and allocate tubes and racks for the show. Looking at the dialog here, you're probably familiar with paragraph 2 of this dialog, which allows you to choose the order of effects for assigning firing system addresses and tubes to. So in this example, I'm going to begin by sorting the effects by the position first. It doesn't matter too much for this example because I think there's only one position. But in general, I'll address one position first and then the next position. And then after that, within the position, for this example, I'm choosing to allocate by the tilt angle first. We're going to change this in a minute. Some people sort by size, some people sort by description, some people sort by part number. There's a long list of things that you might sort by. But for this first example, I'm just sorting from left to right within each position. Paragraph 3 gets a little interesting here. Paragraph 3 allows me to define a one-to-one relationship between the module and the rack. That's very important for these racks because the racks, this type of rack has a module built into the rack. It's pre-wired. So when the addressing algorithm assigns firing system addresses, it needs to make sure that there's only one module per rack. To establish a one-to-one relationship between the module and the rack, you add the constraint that each module is restricted to a single rack, and you add the constraint that each rack is restricted to a single module. So in logic, if A is restricted to 1B, and if B is restricted to 1A, then A and B are bound to each other one-to-one. So this pattern of assigning modules restricted to racks and racks restricted to modules, that connects them one-to-one. Okay. Let's address. Now, you may see some new features here that are pretty recent, so you may or may not have seen them before. One of the new features is the colors that you're looking at right now, which show you the angles of the tubes. The cool colors, green and blue, are the most left-leaning effects, and the warm colors, ultimately to red, are leaning right. So when you look at the racks, from the colors, you can tell, are the tubes angling left or are the tubes angling right? Okay? So when we addressed using the terms that we just chose in that addressing dialog, following the algorithm of tip number 2, it started with the first effect, which was we sorted by tilt. So it started with the most left-leaning effect. And the most left-leaning effect was leaning, let me look at this, minus 70 degrees to the left. And then the addressing algorithm tried, well, will that work for pin number 1? The module number 1, pin number 1. And it did. So module number 1, pin number 1, and then it tried to find a tube, and it found that the tube in this rack, in that corner, also worked for module number 1, pin number 1. So that was the first one in the upper left. So that's why the number 1 pin is for the most left leaning. So then it picked the next, following that algorithm, it picked the next tube and the next effect, and that was also leaning at 70 degrees, so that was also leaning pretty extremely. So it has this effect, leaning 70 degrees, and it then looks for the lowest pin number that will work. It tries pin number 2. Does pin number 2 work? Pin number 2 doesn't work because pin number 2 is in the interior of the row and it can't tilt to 70 degrees. It would bonk into the other one. So then it tries pin number 3. That doesn't work. Tries pin number 4. That doesn't work. Tries pin number 5. That doesn't work. Tries pin number 6. Okay. Pin number 6 is at the end of the row again. So pin number 6 can tilt out to reach the extreme angle of minus 70 degrees. And that's why the second effect that we addressed didn't get pin number 2 because pin number 2 didn't work. It got pin number 6. And then it tried the third event. And that one turns out to be this one, minus 70 degrees also. So you can see the pattern here. It's starting with the most left-leaning effect, and it's assigning them the lowest pin number that's available and the first tube that's available that works for them. So that's why we're getting, if you follow that algorithm, that's why this comes out looking the way that it does. Now it looks pretty, but it's not great. Why is it not great? Well, that whole first rack there is kind of all leaning to the left. And the whole fourth rack there is all leaning to the right. But we didn't make very good use of the fact that that first rack, the tubes on the right are capable of leaning to the extreme right, but they aren't being used that way. What would be more useful is if that first rack there had dark green on the left side of it, meaning that the most left-leaning events were on the outside tubes on the left, and if the tubes on the right of the first rack were red, that would mean they were being allocated to the most right-leaning. So that would be what we're looking for. When we addressed, I'll do it again. When we addressed, we got a dialog that says, it looks like additional racks are required. So I know that this fits. I know that we can do this in 4 racks, but we just haven't figured it out yet. And you can see down here in the diagrams of the modules that some of the pin numbers are red, and those are the effects that couldn't fit in the rack in following the way that we configured the addressing function. If I look at these, I bet they are, look at that. That says 70 degrees, and this says 70 degrees, and this says 70 degrees right there. And you can see that the only tubes that are remaining unfilled are these down here, and they are the interior tubes of the rows, which can't reach 70 degrees. So that's how it got stuck. So here's how to unstick it. Here's how to generate the optimal plan. We'll readdress, and instead of choosing to sort the events from left to right, we're going to choose the events there are the most extreme angles first, and then most horizontal first, and then the most vertical last. So whether it's far to the left or far to the right, both of those are going to be first. Most horizontal tilt. Okay, ready? Here we go. We did not get the dialogue. So that's good news. There are no red squares on the modules down here. That's good news. That means that we have assigned addresses for this show, and we've fit it all in 4 racks. Which sounds like good news, but there's a big problem. Can anybody tell me by looking at this what the big problem is? Collisions. Remember, green means aiming left, and red or orange means aiming right. So if you ever have kind of alternating sequence from left to right of greens and reds, that means that the tubes in the rack are aiming at each other. That's a collision, and that just won't work. You can't set up the rack that way. Okay? So let's do one more thing. We'll readdress, and there's a function here at the bottom of the addressing dialog that says rearrange effects in adjustable angle racks to avoid collisions. So I'm just checking this on, and now readdressing. Now this is what we get. I'm pretty sure this is unimprovable. There are 4 racks. They're all fully allocated. And if you look at the color ranges, they all go from the most green on the left to the most red on the right. Also, if you look at the pin numbers, you see that in the upper left, it's pin number, and then going to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that matches the diagram. That matches the diagram that we had here. When the rack was oriented, when it was not rotated, the pin numbers were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going down on the right. So when we rotate it 90 degrees, then those pin numbers are on the top, going from the upper left. The reason everything turned red when I rotated it is that when I rotated it, that meant that the angles of the tubes were no longer aligned with the angles of the effects in the show design. So I'm going to move directly into one more example here. We've passed through tip number 2, and we've passed through tip number 3, and before resting, I have one more example of a similar rack. Some of you may use a rack like this. It has single axis adjustable tubes, just like the rack that we were just using, the iShot rack. And also, just like the iShot rack, or any rack of this type, the tubes on the ends can rotate to a wider range than the tubes in the interior of the rows. But this rack does not have pre-wired pins. This is not one of the racks with the plug-in tube holders. So let's use the same techniques that we just used for the iShot rack for this rack and see what we get. The first thing that we have to do, just like for the iShot rack, is define this rack so Finale knows what it's doing. You can see the knobs here on the right on the right of the rack, or on the left, I guess, of the rack. And so the knobs, of course, define the axis for the fans. So each fan will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And since the rows are the direction of the fan, that means that a row has 7 tubes in it. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So 5 rows of 7 tubes. 5 rows of 7 tubes. Let me try to remember that. Now we'll go back to finale. And define this rack. Create rack. This rack is called the Craig Co rack. It's also a single shot rack with adjustable fan angles within the rows, but it does not have any pre-wired pins, so that was a difference. Remember, there are 5 rows, and each row had 7 tubes. And the angle ranges are a little bit different, so I have to type them in again. So this angle range is minus 53 degrees to 53. Copy 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Modify the last one. Modify the first one. So I just copy pasted there to get that done. And I think that's it. So we've added the Craig Co rack. And now, similar to the last example, let's use the techniques that we covered in the last example for this similar rack that does not have the pre-wired pins. There we go. Craig Co rack. Okay. It's telling me that I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 racks. And as it turns out, it didn't need to rotate this rack because if everything is going straight up, then the orientation of the rack doesn't matter. So I think it chose that rack to just hold straight up effects, and therefore it didn't have any reason to rotate it or not. But I think it's prettier when it's rotated like all the others, so I'll do that. And let's move these. This is another new feature that you may not have seen. Relatively new, like within the last 2 months. When racks are close together, when they're snapped together, they're called a rack cluster. And now when you move a rack cluster, it draws a shaded area of a color around the cluster to show you that it's connected. So you can see when they fuse together that they become part of the same cluster. Okay, let's address. So we'll readdress here. We still want to address with the most horizontal first, because that was the key idea that allowed us to allocate the right number of racks. But we no longer need to bind the modules to the racks because this rack is not a pre-wired rack. It's just a regular rack. Okay, and we might as well leave that rearrange feature on because that worked pretty well. Let's see what we get. Okay, So this looks a little similar to what we had with the iShot rack, right? And since we have the rearrange feature turned on, we're getting the green on the left and the red on the right. So overall, the colors look very good. In terms of the tube allocation, this doesn't look bad at all. But what is not so great is that look at the module allocation. These are the module numbers here, 1 and 2, 1, 2, and 3, 1, 3, and 4. So if you were setting up these racks in the show, module number 1 is serving all 3 of those racks, and module number 4? Oh, yes, you're right. It's so that's a lot of wires going. There's a lot more room for error. You wouldn't want to do that. And similar with module 2. So this is actually not so great in terms of the module allocation. So even though we didn't need to bind the modules to the racks one-to-one, as we did with the iShot rack, let's do that anyway. Let's assign a single module to a single rack, and then that will clear up the problem of modules being used across multiple racks. Readdress. Doing this again, restricting each module to a single rack and restricting each rack to a single module. That's kind of a pair, rack to module, module to rack. And now readdress. Now, let's look at what we got here. We got the colors look very good, and the modules look very good, but since the modules have only 32 pins, and the rack has 35 holders, it requires more racks. It requires more racks than we have here, now that I've added that constraint. So, where'd that go? So when I address, it says, it looks like you need additional racks. So let's add additional racks. And here is, I think, tip number, let's find out which tip number this is. Tip number 5, when you add a constraint, like we just added the constraint restricting the modules and the racks one-to-one, when you add a constraint like that, that may require more racks. So we shouldn't be surprised when we add a constraint like that and then readdress that more racks are required. There's a nifty feature here. When you address and get this dialog that says more racks are required, it leaves the effects that didn't get a rack selected. There they are. So it automatically selects them. And then I can do the feature in the racks menu, add racks for selected events. And since the selected events are only those that currently do not have racks, then this function is going to add the necessary additional racks. I think there's only one in this case. Yes, sir. I think the question is, why are the racks all tilted sideways instead of straight? And the question is, this is the correct way to shoot the show, so why are my racks all aiming sideways? That's the kind of question that it's a really good question, and it always makes me feel stupid because like I see this 100 times a day, and when I get a question like that, it's sort of like, well, Will, why haven't you fixed this? So I'll give you an answer, and it's the best answer I have right now. The best answer is that we define the rack according to the specifications of the rack and the conventions for what a row means. Tip number 1 was that a row means the row is the direction of the fan angles. So once we committed to that convention, and once we're following the specifications of the rack, if the fan angles, if the rows are the fan angles, then the definition of the rack in finale makes the default orientation of the rack vertical. We had to choose one. We just chose that the default orientation of a rack is the tubes are aiming, the rows are aiming vertical. Why do we do that? Well, initially we were thinking of wooden racks for shells, for outdoor displays. And when you think of a wooden rack, imagine just a single wooden rack of 3-inch shells. That's going to be one row, and when you see it on the screen, it's going to be vertical, right? And maybe the tubes are fanned out within the rack if it's a fan rack. But, you know, the tubes are angling vertical for wooden racks. So once we committed to that convention that vertical is the default, then we were stuck with it for single shot racks also. And so that's why everything comes into finale with the rows by default aiming vertically, and that's why the text is oriented according to the default orientation. And then if you need to rotate the rows horizontally to get it to work for the show, then that rotates the text as well. And so that's why all of the single shot racks generally have the text aiming sideways. Now, it's a very good question, and I give you you ask a good question, sort of, why is it this way? And I give you an answer, well, that's why it's this way. And the follow-up question is, well, can't you do better? And maybe, and I think so. And maybe tonight during the party or sometime later, we can talk through, we have tried some ideas, and we haven't implemented them, but other people like you have complained that if this is what I do all day, I don't want to be looking at sideways text all day. So it's a very legitimate question, and we're just looking for kind of the right design for what we should do to fix it. And then we'll do that. So let's talk later on this evening about that very question. Okay. So I'll readdress now. And when I Testing. Yeah. Good, testing. Okay. Okay. When I hold the cursor over the drag and drop pins link, that's what turns the colors on. And if I click on that link, then the colors stay on. So if you're wondering how to get the colors, that's how you get the pretty colors. Where we ended up here is, I think, a fine solution. We did need an extra rack, but I think most people would choose to use that extra rack if you had it, rather than having modules with wires serving multiple racks. This looks pretty good. This looks pretty good. We used the techniques from the iShot rack for this other rack that does not have pre-wired pins.
No, there's Mike. Yeah. Oh, just this?
Testing. Okay, back to business. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. So I was just saying before I got cut off that this looks like a pretty good result here. Reasonable number of modules, a balance of considerations here for the wiring. But there's a reveal here in this example. We can do better. Anybody have an idea? That's a good idea, but that's not what I'm thinking of. The iShot rack had pre-wired pins, remember? And one of the reasons that pre-wired pins is so great is that it means you can just show up and put tubes in. But pre-wired pins are also pretty nice for arranging the addresses in a rack in an understandable way, in circumstances that allow this. It doesn't apply to all racks, it doesn't apply to all situations. But for a situation like this, what if I just change the rack definition to say, to pretend that this rack had pre-wired pins, similar to the iShot rack. It doesn't, but let's pretend that it does. And let's see what Finale does. Okay, look at this. look at this now. Look at the pin numbers. It goes from 1 in the upper left to 7, 8 through 14, and so forth. And so when your crew are setting up with this rack, it's just easier to wire because you know which wire goes to which tube, so there's less chance of error. And this cost you nothing. It required no more racks, it required no more modules. It's no harder to design the show. So it just saves a few minutes and reduces the chance of error a little bit for the crew. Now, since we're just pretending that it has pre-wired tubes, we don't have to follow the same order that we followed for the iShot rack. We could choose any row because we're just pretending. So if I wanted the numbers to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down on the left instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the right, then I could just change the definition of the rack, edit this rack, change the pre-wired pins. Instead of saying sequential by rows, right to left, I'll say sequential across rows, which is just kind of rotating it. And watch, we'll do it again. Right, and this time you see that the numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going down on the left of each rack. So that's a tip that you can use if you have adjustable angle single shot racks, and if you choose to use this organization. Okay. You guys are hanging in there really well. I knew this was going to be a difficult talk because it's really technical and there's not a lot of flashy graphics, but we're about 80% of the way through. So I just have a few more things I just want to cover to make sure that everybody in the room knows them. And I think most of you are going to know some of these, so this is going to be easier now. For rack layout, I want to switch from single shot racks, so this is no longer the super complex. I just want to switch to basic outdoor displays with wooden racks for shelves for a minute. And let's talk about some basics for chains, for loading chains in racks. I have an example show here, and I'm going to, with some chains in it. So similar to the last examples, I will add racks for the show. Okay, so this. So this position for this show has, I think it has chains of 5, and so we'll add racks for this show. Similar to the previous examples, I just did the function to add racks, and I chose the default rack. This was a 3-inch rack. This rack happened to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. My 3-inch racks in this example had 8 tubes. My chains only have, my chains only have 5 shells in them. So, following tip number 2, the rack addressing algorithm that all of you now are in possession of, the addressing algorithm takes the first chose an effect according to the sort criteria of the rack dialog. And it tries to find the lowest number pin, pin number 1. Then it tries to find a tube to fit that pin in, which is in the upper left corner, it did. And then it looks ahead if it's a chain, or if it's a flight of shells on the same pin number at the same time. It looks ahead to see if it can fit the remaining shells of the chain or shells in the flight in the same rack. So it continues forward. So look at chain number 1 is all of the ones on the left rack. There are 5 of them. And then immediately after that, it starts with chain number 2 in the 6th position of the left rack, and it continues. If you look at chain number 2, it's spilling off of the end of the first rack and starting up again in the next rack. So that may be difficult if the shells in the chain don't have enough fuse to reach from the lower left to the upper, to the top of the next rack. Now, there are a few ways that we could deal with that. I could kind of invert every other rack to cause them to wind up and down. But let's say that we chose, as a crew setting up this, let's say that we decided we did not want to have chains spilling off of a rack onto the next rack, because we just chose not to try to avoid that during our setup. How would we change the parameters in the rack dialog to prevent it? This, I think, is tip number 6. If we restrict each pin to the same rack, then that is going to cause each chain to be restricted to the same rack. If you think about it, all of the shells of a chain are on the same pin, because it's one firing system pin that ignites the whole chain. So if everything that's connected to the same pin is restricted to one rack, then that means that the chain is restricted to one rack. So by adding that constraint, that the pin is restricted to a rack, we then got the second chain to start afresh with the second rack instead of continuing where the first chain left off and wrapping around into the second rack. Okay? So that's one thing we might want to do, but there's a reason not to do it. Notice the red squares down here. When we addressed, we got this dialogue again saying, well, additional racks are required. And just like last time, it's leaving the effects that are unracked selected. So now I can go to the racks menu and say add racks for selected events. It tells me that I need 2 more racks. I click add. It adds the 2 more racks. And now if I readdress, well, okay. So we got what we asked for. If we made the decision as a crew or as a setup designer that we wanted to arrange a single chain per rack, even though the rack has a few extra slots in it, this is what we get, and that's how many racks we need. So that's a fine result. That's one that you could choose. There are other things that we could choose also. I mentioned that we could wind the chains up and down. I'm not going to do that example here, but I will do one other example. Maybe we would like to cross-load the chains across the racks instead of assigning the chains into each rack linearly. So if we cross-loaded the chains, we could get rid of these 2 racks here. And we would like to see chain number 1 occupying the first tube of all 5 racks, and chain number 2 occupying the second tube of all 5 racks. So I'll just show you here. To accomplish that in the rack addressing dialog, All we have to do is, instead of restricting the pin to the same rack, we restrict the pin to the same tube index. So verbally, what I was saying, just pointing out in the diagram, was that we wanted chain 1 to be the first tube of each rack, and we wanted chain 2 to be the second tube of each rack. Well, the first or the second or the third, that's the tube index in the rack. So if we restrict the pin of the pin which occupies the entire chain to the same tube index, then that causes the chains to be cross-loaded across the racks like this. So this is another very viable way that you might choose to set up the show. Okay. I have one last pretty basic example, and then we're all done with racks. So in this last example, I will add racks here. This last example has some 3-inch shells and some 4-inch shells. And this last example deals with situations where you have either you have a pre-made structure of racks, or you just have a pattern of assembling racks together in assemblies. Some people call them pods or collections. In Finale, they call them rack clusters. But maybe you have clusters of 3 or 4 racks that you arrange and repeat in multiple sections in that pattern in the show. So here's how we do that. I began with a show that just has a bunch of 3-inch effects and a bunch of 4-inch effects at different angles. And when I clicked the Add Racks button, Finale added all of the racks that are necessary for this show. That's very nice. It would do that for me. And it arranged the racks sorted by size, with the biggest ones on the left and the smaller ones on the right. And then for each size, it arranged them by angle, with the left-leaning ones on the left and the right-leaning ones on the right. So they aren't going to collide with each other. But this arrangement is not really an indication that Finale thinks this is the best way for you to arrange your racks. It's just an initial arrangement that's convenient and easy for you to see and then rearrange them by dragging and dropping them into whatever arrangement that you want. So for this example, I mentioned that I wanted to create some assemblies of racks, or pods, and Ellen calls them clusters. I'm going to do that here by dragging these racks into clusters. So I'm going to start with this one that is angling 30 degrees to the left. You can see on the top here, that's angling 30 to the left. Each of my clusters has 2 3-inch racks, one aiming 30 degrees, one aiming straight up, and it has a 4-inch rack aiming straight up, then it has another 3-inch rack, and then it has a 3-inch rack aiming to the right. So I'm going to repeat that a few times. Thank you. Okay. Let me- Okay, let's address and see what we get here. Initially, I'll address sorting by tilt. So it begins with the left one and then progresses toward the right hand element. Okay, this is a common starting point here. So here are my racks. I've arranged them into these pods, and you can see that, well, it uses the right number of racks, but again we have this module problem with wires going all over the place. Look at the first module at the bottom of the leftmost rack there is module number 2. And module number 2 is also used in the second pod, in the third pod, well, in the second and the third. So that's kind of a disaster. We have wires going all over the place. And you can see why it did that. Going back to tip number 2, the addressing algorithm, is that the addressing algorithm starts by choosing the effects in the order chosen by the user in the addressing dialog, and we chose to sort by tilt. So it's choosing the leftmost, it's starting with the leftmost aiming tubes, leftmost aiming effects, and then for each one of those effects, it's choosing the first available module and pin number, and so that's causing the first module to be applied to the left aiming tubes of all 4 rack clusters. And that's why it's happening. So now to fix the problem or prevent it from happening, all we have to do is go back to the rack dialog here and set up a constraint that each module is restricted to the same rack cluster. So now, when I look at the modules, I see module 2 is only used in that first cluster. I'm checking module 3 in the second cluster. That's only used in the second cluster. Module 4 only in the third. 5 only in the fourth. Whereas 6 only in the third. 7 only in the fourth. 8 only in the first 9. And then 10, 11, and 12 are just tiny. Okay, so we allocated the right number of modules this time. We don't have any wires spread around. You can check that here if I switch to drag and drop pins and then hold over the module, and you see the wires. And there are no wires from any module that go to multiple, no wires from any module that go to multiple clusters. So that's all nice. We're doing pretty well, except for the fact that, I don't know, a lot of people kind of want the module allocation to go from left to right sort of linearly. It's just prettier that way and more understandable for the crew. And you could see as I was checking the numbers there that they're kind of jumping around. It's not going from left to right. So the last little tip here is how to get the number sequence for your modules to be nice. And the answer is that there's something called, you could say, well, why isn't it automatically doing it that way? And the answer is that it's allocating racks by the rack numbers. And if I click this link here, it shows me the rack numbers. And if you look at the rack numbers at the top here, the rack numbers aren't going from left to right. 10, 14, 6, 15, 22. So the rack numbers are all over the place, and that's why the choice in the allocation algorithm is all over the place. So if I want to fix it, and if I just want to have smooth module numbers from left to right, all I have to do here is select the racks, and then right-click and say renumber the racks left to right. Now look at the rack numbers at the top, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, going all the way to 25. The reason that it started with 6 was that this is the second position in the show, and the first position had rack number 1 through 5. So 6 was the first available number. So we're not quite done yet. The last thing we have to do when we address is, instead of sorting by tilt, we're going to sort by a rack number here. So the semantics of this choice of rack number are a little bit tricky, but at first blush, the easiest way to understand rack number is that it's choosing the next effect to be an effect that is compatible with the next rack number in the sequence. And that usually results in rack numbers being, in modules being assigned according to your progression of rack numbers. So we sorted by position name and then rack number here. So if we look at this now, I think 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Good. So we've got the rack numbers going smoothly from left to right. I don't think we can do any better than this. And that's it. So you guys have made it. Going back to the talk, we made it through all 10 tips. That was the last tip there. And that is by far the longest and deepest, and you're awake, and thank you for that. I hope that some of these 10 tips will be useful for you in your jobs. Thank you.